So we're going to talk about intergroup development. So basically, we're going to focus on organizational developmental interventions that are focused on how teams or groups function with each other. So again, remember that we were talking about the idea that ideally when we're dealing with teams, we're wanting to try to integrate the goals of the individual with the goals of the team, and then the goals of the team with the goals of the organization. So intergroup development is mainly focused with that, how to make sure that each team, now that we've individually worked with teams, they've looked at their own roles, they've set up their own rules, they have their own process, they have their own norms, they're understanding how to communicate well to each other. Now, how do we make sure that they're working well with other teams? And the real concept behind this is that basically, when we're developing teams individually, we're recognizing that the teams themselves are going to be very individualistic. In other words, each team is going to have its own challenges. Each team is going to have its own group of personalities and skills, and even the function of what the team does is going to have some effect on how those roles develop, how those roles are negotiated, and how that team develops a set of norms for communication and for decision making, and that those then may differ within other groups or teams. So changing relationships in today's organizations, most managers now concentrate on shared responsibilities among teams. In other words, in the past, we had the kind of typical hierarchical organizations where a manager had a span of control, which was the number of direct reports that they had under them that they were managing. Today, most managers are actually involved with interacting with groups or teams, and they're now having to share their concentration, but also the responsibility among those teams, and manage how those teams work together for the greater organizational goals. So organizations tend to create situations of team interdependence, and that's again one of the things that we want to look at structurally. The more that individual teams are reliant on other teams to actually get to the larger organizational goals, the more likely they're going to be able to cooperate well together. So again, just like we want to create interdependence within teams, we want to see, can we create a situation with an organization where the teams themselves are interdependent on other teams? When that occurs, there's a natural tendency for that team to recognize and orient its team goals more in line with the actual organizational goals. So OD interventions develop effective work methods between teams, and that's really what we're going to focus on now is just a little bit of what we can do to try to, again, diagnose are there problems with how teams are communicating, and if so, where are those problems coming from, and are there some simple interventions that we can do to reduce the impact of those problems? So we're really talking about the differences between conflict and collaboration. And I don't want to paint either of these as the gold standard or the thing to avoid. So generally speaking, when we're looking at conflict, we're looking at organizations basically. Conflict between teams would be there's a situation where the teams are in direct competition with each other. So that would cause conflict. One team is going to get the award, one team is going to get the contract. So if we had three teams all working on trying to come up with a new commercial, only one of those commercials is probably going to be chosen. So that's going to be a situation of conflict. Collaboration would be if those three teams are each supposed to come up with a good idea, then all three teams come together and work on seeing which of those ideas work together, or maybe elements from all three ideas would work well. That's more of a collaboration situation. So organizations tend to need collaboration and cooperation to be effective, but it really does depend on how the teams are being viewed and what the actual task or the goal of the teams are. So one of the things we need to look at is, are there differences in the objectives and values between each team or group? Conflict is going to be somewhat inevitable between groups. There's really no way to create teams that are working in a similar space on similar goals for there not to at least be some kind of casual social competition between them. The question is, can we set up the actual situation where the teams work together in a way where that conflict is minimized, or is an organization setting up a situation where that conflict is made more likely? Dysfunctional conflict is reduced through intergroup interventions, and that's really what we're wanting to focus on is the idea of dysfunctional conflict. Basically, casual competition, casual rivalry is fine as long as it's still serving the organizational's goal. What we're talking about is when teams are now more worried about outdoing the other team or winning the conflict than they are at actually helping the organization itself. So generally what we're talking about in that case is what's often referred to as sub-optimization, and it occurs when groups optimize its own goals over the goals of the organization, losing sight of those larger organizational goals. And we can kind of predict when sub-optimization is going to occur because intergroup competition generally involves groups conflicting either over purposes or objectives. And the next slide is going to kind of have a model for you, if you will, of how to kind of view, is this something that's likely to be occurring in an organization, kind of as a diagnostic tool. So factors involved in conflict again is, are the teams actually fighting over resources and are they conflicting over goals? So if you have multiple teams that have goals that are not necessarily complementary to each other. So for example, think of this as finance versus research and development. So finance's goal as a team is to reduce costs as much as possible. Their goal is to try to basically squeeze every penny. Research and development's goal is to do what is ever needed to come up with a new product or a new solution to a problem. There's going to be conflict between those two goals. However, if there isn't a major conflict in resources, in other words, if the company actually has a fair amount of money to spend right now, there is a tending to move more money into research and development, that conflict is going to be pretty low. So we have a low conflict potential, even though it's low to moderate. There's still going to be a difference between the two goals, but it's not going to be driven by a conflict of resources. Now consider that same organization, except that the sales have been down for the last 3 quarters in a row. And there's a high norm and focus to reduce costs, reduce costs, reduce costs. Now you're going to have a lot of conflict between that finance team and that research development team because the conflict in resources is very high and the conflict in goals is very high. So generally speaking, if we can keep one of these low, whether it's the conflict of goals or the conflict in resources, we're going to greatly reduce the chance of sub-optimization. Teams are not necessarily going to need to fight each other in that situation. As the resources become less, as there's more conflict, in other words, teams are basically pulling from the same resource pile and it's a finite pile, we're going to start seeing moderate conflict unless we can intervene and help those groups understand how to better share those resources. And that would be an intervention. Likewise, if there's a low conflict of resources, so the two teams are not fighting over the same resources or there's plentiful resources, we have to then look, is there a conflict in goals and can we reduce through an organizational intervention that conflict of goals? And finally, if both situations are high conflict in goals, high conflict in resources, we definitely are going to recognize these teams are going to have a lot of work to do to work well together because we've set up a situation that naturally encourages them to be in conflict, not cooperation. So just another note of role conflict and role ambiguity. We talked about these concepts within a single team, but we also have to recognize that they can occur between teams. In other words, the teams themselves see their roles differently. So for example, finance may be viewing its role solely as reduce costs, while every other team looks at finance team as their role is to optimize how we use our resources in a positive way. That would be a role conflict. Sometimes there may be teams that are a little ambiguous on what their role actually is in the bigger picture of the organization. So within intergroup teams or teams working with teams, we have these same interventions that we can do where we bring teams together to kind of talk about how they view their roles and how they can be brought more in line with the organizational goals. So ambiguity exists when individuals or teams are not clear about his or her function, and role conflict occurs when individuals, when the teams themselves don't understand each other's roles, but it can also happen with individuals when an individual belongs to 2 or more teams and those team goals are in conflict. So we can look at role conflict and role ambiguity both from an individual level. How does that individual who is in multiple teams understand their roles in each and where the ambiguity exists, and is there conflict between those roles? But we can also look at it from the level of the teams themselves. So again, our goal is to move more towards cooperation versus competition. So generally speaking, a lot of organizations get into their head that competition is a good thing. And this is probably a leftover again from kind of the hierarchical, bureaucratic organizations of the 50s, 60s, and earlier. And the idea here is that, basically let the top team or the top person show themselves by being better than everyone else. The problem with competition is it naturally creates a tendency to where now the person, the individual or the individual team, has goals that are more about their success than the success of the organization itself. There's been mixed research results on competition and cooperation between groups. In other words, we haven't found a clear answer that says you should only use competition or you should only use cooperation. Generally, the studies have been pretty mixed. In some situations, competition can be useful. In some situations, cooperation can be. The biggest thing we found is an extreme focus on competition to the basically to where teams are no longer sharing information or even trying to collaborate with anyone around them usually does result in reduced performance within that organization. We do know that members of competitive groups do have more self-esteem for their group, so actually being competitive can have a side effect, excuse me, of increasing the cohesion within individual teams. Groups competing with one another tend to be highly oriented towards the task. So if you have groups that you're wanting to basically increase their self-esteem within their individual groups, and the actual task that the group is doing is very task-focused and very individualized, then competition can result in some increases in these benefits. It's lack of evidence of the benefits directly of competition, though, and what I mean by that is generally speaking, when we look at lab situations where we bring in groups kind of in an artificial setting and either foster competition or foster cooperation, we generally don't find evidence of one or the other giving us immediate results. Also, when we look at teams or organizations in the real world that have focused more on competition versus cooperation, we don't necessarily find a gold standard that one group is actually doing better than another. We do know that cooperation promotes productivity between groups, however, when the task is complicated and requires coordination, especially between multiple teams. So again, the more complex the more the task is interdependent with other teams, the more likely cooperation is going to actually result in better performance.